Welcome back to Nate Lab Mode. AI is everywhere these days. I mean, it feels like it's just woven into every part of our lives. And today, we're going to dive into some research about how all these AI tools are affecting our ability to think critically.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff. And this particular research is kind of cool because it takes two different approaches to understand this whole AI and critical thinking thing.
Okay, so what did they do?
Well, they did surveys with a ton of people,
Yeah.
666 to be exact.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah. And they had folks from all over the UK, different ages, teenagers to older adults, and with different educational backgrounds too.
It's a pretty good representation then.
Yeah. And then they also did these deeper interviews, like follow-up conversations
Mm.
with 50 of those people to really get into their experiences.
Nice. So a really well-rounded look at this.
Exactly.
Okay, before we get too deep into this, let's hear a quick word from our sponsor.
Sounds good.
All right, today's deep dive is brought to you by CloutFit.ai. Now, if you're in the business world, you know how important influencer marketing is, right? Well, CloutFit.ai connects influencer outfits, what they're wearing in their posts and videos, directly to your product inventory. Pretty cool, huh?
Definitely.
It makes their content instantly shoppable, driving more sales and, a higher value for your business.
Yeah, that's a game changer for sure.
If you're intrigued and want to learn more, head over to cloutfit.ai. That's CLOUTFIT.aa.
Okay, so back to this AI and critical thinking research. The big question here, the one we're really trying to unpack for you, is how does relying on AI tools change the way we think critically? Are there hidden costs or consequences we should be aware of?
Yeah. Okay, so before we get into the findings, let's define what we mean by critical thinking and this cognitive offloading thing that keeps popping up.
Sure. Critical thinking is basically your ability to analyze information, see if it's good quality and if it's relevant, and then use all that to make good judgments and make decisions, like problem solving, making choices, and thinking carefully about the information you have.
So not just memorizing facts, but how you use them.
Exactly. This research looked at the work of some thinkers like Ennis, who describes it as using reasonable and reflective thought to decide what to believe or do, and then Paul and Elder, who see it as analyzing and improving your own thinking.
Got it. Now, what about cognitive offloading? It sounds a little bit like, jargony.
It's actually pretty simple. It's basically when we use tools or aids to help us with mental tasks, like outsourcing some of our thinking,
Okay.
like making a shopping list so you don't have to remember everything, using a GPS to get around, and in this case, using AI tools to find information or solve problems. Risco and Gilbert, they're really important researchers in this area, and they describe it as delegating those mental tasks to external things, like your phone or AI.
So it frees up mental energy, but maybe we're not thinking as hard about the task itself.
Right, yeah.
Like if you always use a GPS, you might forget how to read a map.
Yeah, exactly.
So what was the main takeaway from the research? What did they find about AI use and critical thinking?
Well, the big finding, and it was pretty clear, was a negative correlation between how much people used AI tools and how well they did on critical thinking tests.
So the more AI, the less critical thinking.
Yeah, basically.
That's kind of a big deal, right? I mean, considering how much we use AI every day, makes you wonder what'll happen in the future.
Definitely something to think about. And there was another thing that was interesting. The study also found that younger people, like those between 17 and 25, were using AI tools way more, and they tended to score lower on critical thinking compared to older folks, like those 46 and older, who didn't use AI as much.
That makes sense, right? If you grew up with AI, it's just normal to let it do some of the thinking for you.
Right. It's like second nature. Now, one thing that was interesting is they found people with more education generally had better critical thinking skills.
Makes sense.
And that was true regardless of how much AI they used. So it seems like education might give you a kind of foundation in critical thinking.
Okay, so education is like a buffer.
Yeah, you could say that.
Now, they kept mentioning cognitive offloading as a reason for this negative connection between the AI and critical thinking. Can you explain how that works?
Sure. So they found that the more people used AI, the more they were offloading those mental tasks to AI. And this, in turn, was connected to weaker critical thinking, like a cycle. More AI, less thinking on your own, and that might hurt your ability to think critically over time.
So AI itself isn't bad. It's how we use it that matters, like how much we let it take over our thinking.
Right. It's not the tool, but how we interact with it. There's this thing called the Google effect, which was explored by Sparrow and some other researchers. It's basically the idea that because we know we can find information online so easily, we don't bother remembering it. We just remember where to find it.
Yeah. Why bother remembering if I can just Google it, right?
Exactly. And that's a perfect example of how cognitive offloading, with things like search engines and now AI, can change our memory and how deeply we process information.
Interesting. The study also looked at how AI might be affecting specific cognitive processes, right? Like our memory, attention, and problem solving. What did they find there?
Yeah, they did. So with memory, as we talked about, AI can give us information instantly. So we don't really need to store that knowledge ourselves. This might affect something called transactive memory, where we remember where to find information instead of the information itself.
Like our brains are becoming pointers to data instead of storing the data.
Yeah, it's a good way to think about it.
What about attention?
Well, AI is a bit of a double-edged sword with attention. On the one hand, it can help us filter all the information out there and focus on what's important, like personalized news feeds.
Right.
But then, we have all these notifications and updates from AI-powered things, which can break our attention, making it harder to concentrate on one thing for a long time.
Totally. It's
Yeah.
like our attention is constantly being pulled in a million directions.
Exactly.
What about problem solving? How does AI affect that?
So AI can be really useful for making decisions. It can analyze huge amounts of data and give recommendations. This is super helpful in fields like medicine and finance.
Makes sense.
But there's a worry that if we rely on AI too much for problem solving, we might not develop our own analytical skills.
Mm.
Jonason, he's a big name in this field, he talks about how important it is to actually engage in problem solving for our cognitive growth.
So if AI is always giving us the answers, we're not exercising those thinking muscles.
Exactly. It's like the saying, use it or lose it, but for our minds.
Makes sense. And the study also mentioned this idea of cognitive laziness and cognitive dependence. Can you break those down for us?
Yeah, so cognitive laziness is the idea that if we have AI tools that can do the hard thinking for us, we might not want to think hard ourselves. Like, why struggle with a problem when AI can just solve it?
Right. It's the easy way out.
Exactly. And then cognitive dependence is like the next level. It's the idea that we become so reliant on AI that we can't function well without it. Like someone who's totally dependent on a GPS trying to get around a new city without it.
That's a little scary to think about.
Yeah, it is.
And the research also brought up this black box problem. What's that all about?
Right. So the black box problem is basically that we don't always understand how some AI systems make decisions.
Okay.
So when AI gives us recommendations or makes decisions, we might not know why it chose that particular thing. This lack of transparency can make it harder to critically evaluate that information, and we might just blindly accept what AI says without questioning it.
So we might stop using our own judgment if we don't understand how the AI got to its conclusion.
Right.
Okay. The research also talked about how all this affects education, right? What did they find about AI in learning environments?
Yeah, this is a big one. So AI has the potential to be amazing for education. It can personalize learning, give students feedback tailored just for them.
Sounds great.
Right. But the concern is that students might get too used to AI giving them all the answers.
Makes sense.
If AI is always there to do the work, students might not learn how to think for themselves and solve problems on their own. The research points to a possible decline in how actively students engage in critical thinking because of this.
So AI can be a great tool, but we need to make sure it doesn't stop students from developing essential skills.
Exactly.
What about automated grading? Did they talk about that?
Yeah, they did. Automated grading systems can give quick feedback on things like grammar and style, which could be helpful. But some researchers, like Perelman, worry that these systems might make students focus on writing in a specific way that the algorithm likes, instead of focusing on having strong arguments and deeper critical thinking.
So it's more about getting the format right for the AI than actually understanding and thinking deeply.
Yeah, that's the concern.
So we've talked about all this data and statistics, but the researchers also interviewed people, right? What did they learn from those conversations?
Yeah, the interviews are really interesting. They added a human element to all the numbers. 3 big themes came up. One was AI dependence.
Okay.
A lot of people, especially younger ones, said they relied a lot on AI for different things. One person even said, and this is a direct quote, "I use AI for everything. It's become a part of how I think."
Wow.
It really shows how deeply AI is becoming part of how some people think, especially younger folks who, as we saw in the data, are using AI more.
Yeah, it's not just a tool anymore. It's becoming part of their thinking process. What was the second theme?
The second theme was about cognitive engagement.
Okay.
Some people were worried that using AI more was making them think less for themselves. One person said, "The more I use AI, the less I feel the need to problem solve on my own." This backs up the idea that offloading thinking to AI might make us less engaged mentally.
So it's not just a statistical thing. People are actually noticing it happening in their own minds.
Right.
What was the last theme?
The third theme was about ethics. People talked about their worries about things like bias in AI algorithms and not knowing how AI makes its recommendations. One participant said, "AI tools might be steering me towards biased decisions."
That's a good point. If we don't know how AI works, it's harder to know if its suggestions are based on good information or biased data.
Exactly.
Did the interviews also show anything about how education level might affect how people see AI?
Yes, they did. It seems that people with higher levels of education were more aware of the potential downsides of relying on AI. They were more likely to think critically about the information they got from these tools. One person with a doctorate said, "While I find AI tools useful, I always try to question the information they provide. My education has instilled in me the importance of not taking things at face value, especially with something as complex as AI."
That makes sense. Education gives you those critical thinking skills you need to navigate this world of AI.
Right.
What about those with less formal education?
The interviews suggested a difference there. People with less education tended to trust AI more and didn't always think critically about it.
Okay.
One person with a high school diploma said, "I use AI because it makes things easier, but I do sometimes wonder if I'm losing my own ability to figure things out." And another person with some college experience said, "I don't really think too much about it when I use AI. I just assume it's correct."
So there's a chance this gap in critical thinking skills could widen depending on your education level. Now, I know the researchers use some pretty complex statistical methods to analyze their data. Can you give us a quick summary of what they did?
Sure. They used a bunch of statistical tools to look at the data in different ways. For example, they used correlation analysis to see if there was a relationship between AI use and critical thinking scores. And they found that there was, but it was a negative one,
Okay.
meaning as AI use went up, critical thinking scores went down. They also use something called regression analysis, which helps to see if AI use can predict critical thinking, even when considering other factors. And then they use this more advanced technique called random forest regression.
Sounds complicated.
It is, a little bit. But basically, it's like building a lot of different prediction models to see which factors are most important. And the bottom line was, all these different analyses showed that more frequent use of AI was linked to weaker critical thinking.
So no matter how they looked at it, the message was pretty consistent.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, the researchers also talked about some limitations of their study, right?
Right. They were very upfront about that. One thing was that they had to rely on people being honest about how much AI they use and how good they think their own critical thinking is. Those self-reports might not always be completely accurate.
Makes sense.
And the participants were all from the UK, and they were recruited online, so they might not represent everyone perfectly, and the findings might be different in other countries or cultures.
Those are good points to keep in mind. Did they suggest any areas for future research based on what they found?
Yeah, they had a lot of interesting ideas for future studies. They mentioned looking at how AI use and critical thinking change over longer periods, like doing studies that follow people for several years. They also talk about looking at different types of AI tools separately to see if some have more impact on critical thinking than others. And they suggested doing experiments where they actually control how much people use AI to see the direct effects. And they also highlighted the need to do research in different cultures and to explore why some people are more likely to offload their thinking than others.
So lots of exciting directions for future research. So to sum it all up for our listeners, what's the key takeaway from this deep dive into the research on AI and critical thinking?
The big takeaway is that while AI tools offer a lot of benefits, making things easier and more efficient, this research suggests there might be a cost when it comes to our critical thinking skills. The more we rely on AI to think for us, the less we might be using and strengthening those critical thinking muscles ourselves.
It's a reminder to be mindful of how we use these powerful tools. So what can we do? How do we make sure we're staying sharp?
It really highlights the need to keep working on our critical thinking skills in this world where AI is becoming more and more prevalent. This is important for everyone, not just for educators or people who make policy. Think about how you use AI and whether it's maybe making you think less for yourself. And consider making a conscious effort to seek out activities that require deep thinking, problem solving, and analyzing things independently, even if you still use AI for some tasks. It's about finding a balance.
Mindful usage, not total rejection.
Exactly.
So as AI becomes even more a part of our lives, how can we make sure it helps us improve our thinking skills, not weaken them?
That's the million-dollar question,
Hmm.
and one we all need to be thinking about.
Absolutely. If you enjoyed this deep dive and found it insightful, we'd love for you to share it with others who might be interested. And if you want to hear more deep dives like this, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for listening.